I am thrilled today to welcome two incredible gentlemen into the studio with me today to discuss something so important. John Tierney and Roy Baumeister. Wow. I can't believe I'm talking to you guys. This is amazing. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, you two have written a phenomenal book called The Power of Bad. I'm going to hold it up. And we're going to, just the title immediately has got everyone's attention, The Power of Bad. But before we dive in, I'd love you both just to tell us a little bit about yourselves. Tell us something that's not in your bio as well. People love to know the little ins and outs. So who'd like to go first? Roy or John?
I'll start. I'll tell you, I've been a science journalist at the New York Times for science magazines, and I started. And I'll tell you how I met Roy. That's not in the bio. I started writing the science column at the New York Times, and I was going to the big social psychology meeting, and it was being held in Memphis that year. And I thought, well, I'm going to a meeting with social psychologists. Wouldn't it be fun to go visit Graceland, Elvis's home?
Yeah.
And I asked them, why would somebody go visit, this home? And I asked Ben Carey, who covers social science for the Times, why, I said, who could you recommend a good social psychologist who would be able to talk about something that weird? And he thought, he goes, you need someone with a really wide range, a really interesting mind. And he goes, Roy Baumeister. That's how I met Roy, and we ended up. We never got to Graceland, but we ended up, writing a book called Willpower together, and then this book, and this book had answered a question. I can talk about it later, but it answered a question I'd always wondered in journalism, which is why are we so obsessed with bad news, and why do people read it? So, and Roy helped answer that question for me. Why don't you go ahead?
Go ahead, Roy.
Okay, I'm a researcher, a psychology laboratory person. I've spent my career at various universities in the U.S. and most recently moved to University of Queensland for an adventure. Live on the other side of the world. It's always a good thing for a social scientist to experience another
for
culture
sure.
and other things.
Well, you live in a beautiful part of the world. Wow.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And I got into this, it just became a pattern. I forget what were the first things I noticed, but I guess the unusual thing about this is that I have a lot of scientific publications, and they're mostly linked to my big programs of research. And this is not. This kind of came out all by itself. It was a review article about 20 years ago that was the scientific basis for the book. And it's in the interim, it's become like my second most cited paper. They track scientific influence by how often an article is listed in the references in other articles. So this has quietly moved up to number 2. All my other top ones are part of my big research programs. The Willpower one, I've done research on that for 20 years and so on. But this one was kind of by itself, but it was a really intriguing thing. And, I can talk about how it shaped up. But, initially I saw, there's a pattern here that reminded me, here and a few other places I noticed that the bad things seem to have stronger effects than the good things in terms of if there's a neutral control group, for example, the bad always had a stronger effect from it. So I said, well, let's find out what the exceptions are, and that will make a really interesting theory. And so we had all our pet hypotheses about the exceptions, but none of them panned out. It just seemed to be true everywhere. So it's a little disappointing in one side because it doesn't make as interesting a theory, but it adds excitement in the other thing because, you've really captured onto one of the basic properties of the mind, that it just reacts more strongly to bad things everywhere.
Fascinating. Wow, what a great combination to bring because I know, John, you've dealt with a lot. You've been really looking at this whole thing of why we attract to bad for so many years and written about that a lot in your columns, haven't you? So just to now put all this together and combine, and you got some cool things like the bad diet, and so I want to get into all these things. That's some really, really great stuff. Well, so I've got so many questions. So the first question I'm going to start with is just tell us a little bit about the book, just like what have you, the big overview, and then how, and then we can dive in a little deeper to the detail.
Well, I'll go first because I had done the review article, which looked at the scientific findings in one area after another. There's effects on memory and on emotions and on mental processes and brain scans and all these things, found it over and over again. So I thought, well, this is already half a book there. But the editor said, yeah, the general public doesn't want to read a book that has the same point made over and over again, even though that's really what impresses scientists. So I was really lucky to team up with John, who has this great sense of not only what people are interested in, but also politics and relationships and lots of other things going on in the world. So the science part is there, but John really brought the book to life by adding so much other perspective.
Well, it was so much fun doing this because, Roy is such a great wide-ranging thinker, and, and this paper just applied to everything. And since Roy wrote it, it's just been cited, political scientists cited to explain why, Germany started World War I, because they focused on the bad. They were so focused on the threat, and they overemphasized it. And just in my own, field, I a lot of my career was spent looking, why do we keep hyping bad news? There were always basically, journalists always look for the bad news, and we always hype it. And I just found throughout, my career that just about every crisis you hear about turns out to be greatly exaggerated, and I think it's one thing we can talk later, but the COVID, crisis now, it's been hard for people to take seriously because we're so used to all these things being bogus. It's the boy who cried wolf. We've heard them cry wolf so many times that people don't take it seriously when there is something real comes along. And even then there are risks. We could talk about that more later, but that you still overreact to it and you do more harm than good. So, and when I read, Roy wrote this paper, Bad is Stronger Than Good, a great title for a paper.
Very good.
And I read that, that's my whole business. And then once you start looking around, you see it in relationships, you see it at work, you see it in school, you see how students learn, you see it in business, and you see it in politics and public life. You just see it everywhere once you start looking at it. This negativity effect, the fact that bad emotions and bad events are just universally stronger than good ones. That's the negativity effect.
So I'm going to echo what I know that the listeners and viewers are busy thinking at the moment. What is it and why? Okay, what is it? What is this negativity bias and why?
Go ahead, Roy.
In a nutshell, the mind reacts more strongly to bad things than to good things. So
that's the basic overview.
The short of this. And so as a result, we are biased to attend to bad things, to think about them more, to have stronger feelings about them, to remember them better, and to react. And in planning on the future, we worry more about bad outcomes. Like John said, it seems to be something that's true everywhere. But that's the basic point.
It's also called the negativity bias or the negativity effect or negativity dominance. It goes by various names, but it is this, that it causes your body to react more. You see it in physical reactions, brain reactions, the way people react in their lives. And it just, bad rules us in so many ways, that way, the power of bad. So and I guess the other, point about the negativity effect is that it's useful in some ways, and it's, and it did evolve. You asked why it's there, and it evolved for a very good reason. That that it was more, because death has, life has to survive every day. Death only has to win once. So so you really have to pay attention to bad things. And on the ancient ancestral hunter-gatherer savannah, the ones who paid more attention to threats like poisonous berries or predatory lions, they're the ones who survive versus the ones who spend all their time enjoying the good food or enjoying a nice sunset. So it's a useful thing, and it's still really useful in that in bad events, it's the best way to learn. You learn from failure more than you learn from success. And so bad fulfills this great function of teaching you things and keeping you alert to danger. So so in our book, we wrote the book, we want to tell people how to harness that power of bad when it's useful, but how to overcome it when when you're overreacting.
I love that. I love that about your book, how you actually tell people how to harness it. So it's not just, it's all bad. You just, you're just going to always be oriented to the bad, but you actually how you can take that and use that in a positive way.
There was one suggestion to name the book Breaking Bad.
I've been calling your book Breaking Bad. I have to be honest with you.
Well, we liked it. We talked to our publisher. We said, we don't want to spend the rest of our lives saying, no, it's not a book about a TV show about making meth, you know?
You had a whole, but I'm sure people bring that up all the time because it was like the first thing. Oh, you're doing the interview about Breaking Bad, Power of Bad, not Breaking Bad, you know? So it's good.
Someone just asked me about a title. Someone just said to me, did you ever think about titling it The Power of Negative Thinking? Did we ever think of that, Roy? That's not too bad.
No, that's a good one. Yeah.
No, I like your one better. I think The Power of Bad is much more attention grabbing and you know, and I love what you, I mean, I'm a neuroscientist. So I've studied the mind-brain connection for 38 years and I do clinical trials, and I've just finished a set of, and I deal with like the science of thought. So what's fascinating for me when I was reading through your book and just seeing how you counter, how you can use bad for good, how you can, and I want us to get into that. It's fascinating because that's exactly, you change the wiring in your brain. You know, I look at the response, I use QEEGs and we use physiology and we look at the body, you know, blood, hormones, DNA. We look at all kinds of psychological scales, including like the narrative. So now I'm talking Roy's language here with all these things. And it's very interesting to see how when you are thinking, when you manage your mind, how that deep down level, the non-conscious level, the deepest part of you immediately is picked up in the brain immediately. Whereas you're conscious, you can kind of pretend on one level that you are consciously, you know, like you can kind of kid yourself, but you can't actually kid what you really believe. And that conflict and I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, I see that when we're aware of the negative, then that can be the prompt, because it's what I've seen in my research, is that this can be the prompt that then makes you look for, okay, well, that's the negative. I'm aware now. It's like an awareness. Now, how do I now counter this? Is that sort of the idea that you bringing forth when you talk about like your bad diet and how you can make it work for you?
Well, the low bad diet is a suggestion for how to cope with this. But you're right in terms of how brain and mind work. You know, if it spots something negative in the environment, that sort of sets off the alarm bell and it directs the conscious attention to move over there. So you see a crowd of faces and one of them is looking pretty angry. You know, even though you're initially just scanning the crowd, not looking at all, part of you spots that one and says, aha, look at that guy. He's mad at you. And so your attention zeroes in on that. And the studies confirm that. People will notice, you know, if there's one happy face in the crowd, one person liking you, it's not like the same thing happens, or not to the same degree. But it's the combination of scanning the environment for anything negative, and then when anything is spotted, directing the attention to that and devoting more processing to that, because that's the evolutionary result. That's what's important. What's the negative thing in the environment? What's the danger? What's the threat? First, deal with that.
Right.
And then you've got to resolve it.
And there are those experiments, the Stroop test, I think, too, where that a negative thing really interferes with your thinking much more than a positive thing does. You just immediately start focusing on that, and I mean, when you're giving evaluations to an employee, it's a negative thing that suddenly just turns their brain on alert, and they forget everything they heard before that. They're so focused on the negative thing.
So it's good to focus on the negative so that you can grow, but it's also good to balance it with the positive.
Right.
So that's from what I see what you're saying in your book. So if you let's put I've got your press pack out, and you had some great comments, like you talk about bad in parenting and education, and use bad to tackle the crisis. Can you talk about maybe what of those topics would you like to dive into first?
Well, the parenting is interesting because there's such a pressure a lot of people feel to be the perfect parent, and the competition to do everything right, and so on, and to be the perfect mother, and so on. And I was struck by the great Sandra Scara had this line some time ago that you really just need to be a good enough mother. And over the years, the data have really borne that out, that if you're in the top 90%, then it doesn't make that much difference. If you're in the bottom 10%, you can really mess up your kid. They have even studies with IQ, with intelligence, that, and I remember when our daughter was born, I wondered, well, what Mozart songs do I need to play in the crib to give her the best intelligence? And I had some colleagues who studied intelligence. I said, what do I need to do so she'll be intelligent? And they said, well, try not to drop her on her head.
That's good advice.
That was already in my plans, though. I didn't need experts to tell me that. But they had very nice data showing that the worst parents really do make your kids stupider. You can go from the genes to how well does the kid turn out. The best parents do not make your kid smarter. They just enable the kid to live up to the genetic potential. So there's a clear sense that bad parenting is really bad. But again, we're talking the bottom 5 or 10%. And the top 90%, it doesn't really make that much difference. So you could tell parents, give yourself a break. Stop worrying. You don't have to be perfect. Just avoid doing anything really bad.
Right.
That's good.
I mean, that applies to everything. I mean, be a good enough partner or spouse, be a good enough employee or boss. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to avoid mistakes. One of the sort of general concepts we offer in the book, we call the rule of 4. And this is, it's not a universal law of nature, but it's a pretty useful rule of thumb that it takes 4 good things to overcome 1 bad thing. So when you're trying to, for self-improvement, you get a lot more leverage by eliminating the bad than you do by doing the good. And, it's a lesson that if you're late for one meeting, you don't make up for it by being early the next time. You got to do more than that. And when you're evaluating someone, or if you have to criticize someone, don't think, well, you say one nice thing and one good thing, one nice thing and one bad thing, and it's going to even out. They just, that one word of criticism is what sticks with people. And, the one comment really, that's what they go home thinking about, the one nasty thing they heard at the party. They go home thinking about that instead of all the nice things they heard. So I think if you keep that ratio in mind and really try to really, de-emphasize the bad, get rid of the bad, and then when there is bad, you got to really compensate with a lot of good stuff for it. That 4-to-1 ratio we talked about.
That's a really good tip. So if you've had, even for yourself, let's say that you have a negative comment on social media, or someone climbs into you, is to try and find immediately 4 good comments or 5 good comments, and to try and keep the balance. Otherwise, because if I understand from my research, the brain is always trying to get balance and coherence. And so whenever we pay attention to, from my understanding, we pay attention to the bad because it's thrown balance off. And you see that in the brain. You see the different energy, the gamma waves and the high beta, and it goes into this kind of waterfall effect instead of a nice wave effect. And so if you've got that, your attention's been grabbed, so now you're trying to get the balance again. So the 4-to-1, the attention being drawn to the negative, and then to balance the negative is because it's imbalance. So you want to balance it. So the 4-to-1 helps to bring the balance back, because we're so almost like obsessed with trying to restore balance that has the imbalance that's been created by the negative. Does that kind of align with what you're teaching?
Well, yes, I think the key point in what you're saying is that it's not one good thing to balance out one bad thing. It takes several good things. And you know more about the brain probably than either of us does. But in relationships, I know a lot of people are stuck at home with their long-term spouse and partner.
Yeah, at the moment.
And as John had the line, I married you for better or worse, but not for lunch. You're not used to spending 24 hours a day with you. And so there you really have to be careful about the negative things. And if you do say something unkind, then try to say 4 good things to do it.
I love that. And that's something super easy that people can do, because you can catch yourself saying that negative thing and think, okay, I've said one negative, let me now consciously and deliberately say 4 good things. And that brings a balance back. I think that's fantastic. I mean, that in itself could save a relationship, especially with everyone, as you say, married you for life, but not for lunch. I love that.
And so what you say about social media too, try and find 4 good comments. That's a nice one. I mean, another bit of advice we have is that one bad comment has such an impact on people, such an emotional impact that, one piece of advice is don't read your own comments. Have someone else. When I started writing an op-ed column at the New York Times, which, I'm kind of libertarian in my sensibility. New York Times readers are not. And another writer who he was a liberal who wrote for the Wall Street Journal, and of course has a different audience.
Yeah.
He said, it's great. It's a great gig to be writing for the other side, kind of, that keeps you honest. You can't just get away with being lazy. You got to make good arguments. There's all that. But he said, so it's nice to do that. He goes, but my one piece of advice is, don't read the mail. Don't read the email.
I think that's really, really good advice.
Yeah. So our advice in the book is have someone else read it for you, because there's, you learn more from bad. And so there, the criticism can be useful.
Yes.
But the personal stuff, the nasty stuff, it's going to drag you down so much. You don't have someone else go through it for you. Pick out the useful stuff, and then when they give it to you, make sure they give you 4 good things for every bad.
Exactly, and give it to you in such a way that it's actually a constructive learning lesson, because you talk a lot about that in your book, about how you can, that bad is linked to learning. I love that combination that you highlighted. Can you talk about that?
Well, no doubt that's one of the reasons the brain focuses more on bad things, is that in order to get better, that's where there's a problem, something needs to be fixed. If everything's perfect and you feel good, you don't really need to change anything. So there's no learning agenda. It's just, let's keep it like this, or
complacency.
Let's do it again.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you don't have to analyze if something turns out badly. Well, presumably it isn't all bad. So you analyze each part, what went wrong, what was exactly the problem, what can I do different next time?
I love that. So it's constantly taking that failure and turning it into a learning moment, or taking that negative into a learning moment to improve and change.
We write about called the marriage hack, as the psychologist Eli Finkel calls it, which is when you get in an argument with your spouse, and they did an experiment where they sent people home, and they said, when you have an argument, do 2 things. Try to imagine how a neutral referee would look at this. What would they think about this? And then the other thing, and that helps a lot, because bad is a very personal thing. When something bad happens to someone else, we're not as we can see it and say, well, it wasn't really that bad. But when it's personal, then we really react viscerally. And the other thing they told them to do was try to imagine some good that could come out of this argument. What could you learn from this? And we talked about we used this novel from Trollope called He Knew He Was Right, that's about this marriage that falls apart. And at each point, it's this perfectly happy couple and nothing really goes wrong, but they just keep escalating and misinterpreting the other one and taking offense. And at every point, if either of them had just stopped and said, what could I learn from this, that I think I didn't mean any harm, but she reacted that way. So he should have thought, well, I should do it differently next time. I should have made my point in a different way. And then and the wife kind of overreacts, and her sister's saying to her, don't pay any attention to that. He didn't mean anything by it. But she won't, and they can't learn, from their arguments. And that's what you need to do for a relationship to grow and to grow for anything in life.
That's so true, because you can actually, it takes you that one step further. Others, you just say complacency, and they'll just, that's just the worst thing we can do, is just say complacent. So that bad can actually push you to another level. Right. Roy, you want to just go?
Oh, I was just going to say, John's got me to reading Trollope's novels, and he is a fine writer, very interesting. But this particular one, I couldn't finish just because it's just the way he said it. And I kept reading it. He said, no, don't say that. No, don't overreact to this. No.
You're like, read my book. Read my book.
If only they'd had our book.
Exactly. That whole novel would have been different. No, absolutely. You were going to say something, John?
I was going to say that same principle about learning from bad stuff, that when you're evaluating an employee, doing that, or when you're evaluating a student, that we talk about how to do this, about, get to the bad stuff probably early. Because, the natural tendency is I want to start with the easy stuff and tell them what they're doing well. And then, there's a thing called the criticism sandwich that managers have been using for a long time, which was, a lot of nice stuff, then put a little criticism in, and then a little nice stuff, and then they leave. And what they don't realize is the way the brain reacts is that people are just sitting there waiting for the bad stuff, and then as soon as the bad stuff comes, they forget all the good stuff, and so they walk out of that meeting thinking they're just obsessed and they're demoralized. So it's generally better, you can start off by saying, we're not going to fire you. You had a good job, that, and say a few nice, but then get to the bad stuff right away. That puts the brain on high alert, and then put on lots of good stuff, at least 4 good things for every bad thing to make up for it. And then also, as you said, to be constructive, to say, to someone who doesn't do well in a group project, say, you're a great self-starter, and next year we're going to have an we want you to do some more work on your own because you're such a great self-starter on your own. And you kind of, someone who has a hard time with deadlines, you just say, next year, I think we're going to do something differently so that, that'll be, to do that. And so look at ways to, to build on the future that, to recognize what the problem was. You don't want them walking out thinking everything's perfect, but then, put a positive spin on it, how we're going to improve that next year.
I really like that. So to go away from the criticism sandwich, I like that. So whatever, so the nice, the bad, the nice again. So you're saying come straight in with a very clear, constructive, down the line, these are the issues, and then transition over to something that's the 4 good things, lots of good things.
Yeah, I mean, that's generally a good approach. I mean, one other thing, there's interesting research where they've looked about how to deliver bad news. And, some of the best work has been done by sociologists studying doctors because they give bad news all day long. And you'd think they would be experts at it. And what they found was that they're really not very good at it. And one mistake they make is to think there's absolutely one way to do it. And they found that people who are really doctors with a great bedside manner, what they really do is they ask a lot of questions, and so we say instead of a criticism sandwich, think of a menu, a criticism menu, and you can kind of say to someone, well, we've got some, and one thing doctors do, for instance, instead of saying, well, this terrible diagnosis here, this is if they've seen any of the stuff themselves, say, well, what do you think about this? What do you think's going on? And let the patient say, well, it looks like, we've got a problem here. And then you agree with them instead of that you're the bad guy telling them what's there. And they want to start arguing back at you. It's not that bad, or it's not this. So you basically, let them say it. And then as you go along, really watch their reactions, don't just, and there's a tendency also when you give bad news that you want to start, you want to switch to something, and let's get into how we solve the problem. Let's get into logistics. Let's get into something that's less uncomfortable. But give them some time to process the information, listen to them, and really ask questions and really watch how they're reacting to it. So, so one way is, I've got, there's some really great stuff happen, and there's some stuff that we need to improve on. Which would you rather hear first? And most people want to hear the bad stuff first.
They do. So get it out of the way, and then because then you know that there's going to, okay, this is it. Now I can actually start doing something about it. So that I love how you've explained that, because it just throughout your book you pair those two together quite very well. That there's there's this bad stuff, but then there's, hey, that's going to open up possibilities for a solution. You offer that all the way through, which is really good.
Oh, thank you.
Another thing too is, and this is from many years of advising PhD students and postdocs and so on, often the bad isn't really very bad.
That's a good one.
And so, but they're nervous. They're waiting for it. And so, if you start off with all this good stuff, they won't even hear it. Come on, get to the what's the problem?
Just want,
And then so, if you go through the problems, well, it's really not so bad. And if that's the worst there is, well, that's fine. And the room for improvement. And now let me hear the good stuff.
Yeah, I think that's really such a positive way of doing it. I mean, when I was doing my PhD, my mentors did this. They called them promoters in South Africa. That's what they did. They would tell me, okay, these are all the red lines. There's all the the stuff, and then, okay, now how do we build? So it is a good way to not, it's better to get, and I love the 1-to-4 ratio. That's really excellent. I wanted to ask you, how is this related to catastrophizing? This negative effect.
I think that, well, I mean, there's a personal way it happens, in that we just tend to immediately, you think about the bad, and we've also got the tendency to think the worst. We also have in our minds, there's a bias called the availability bias, which is that it's easy that we overestimate how likely something is, how likely a catastrophe is, based on how available that image is to our brain. And, so we've just seen images of terrorist attacks and school shootings over and over again. So people just overestimate how likely that is, and they have this exaggerated fear. It's something like 40% of Americans are worried that they or someone in their family will be killed in a terrorist attack. In reality, it's more dangerous to step into your bathtub. The odds are that way. But people just have that image, and so they catastrophize that. And so you want to try to overcome that visceral bias and use your rational brain to think about that. So, I mean, even here now in the COVID epidemic,
yeah.
I mean, it's very frightening. We're seeing these terrible images, and it's a real problem, certainly for some people. But, the fact remains, you want your rational brain to tell you, for probably 99% of the people, we don't know exactly yet, it's, they're not going to die. And, maybe more than that. We don't really know.
We don't know yet.
So, even if you get infected, the odds are pretty high that an awful lot of people nothing happens to. So you want to try and keep that rational thing in brain. Whereas I think people have this thing, oh my God, there's a bug out there and it's going to invade me, and it's invasion of the body snatchers, or those kind of horror images come. Yeah. And obviously, I mean, it also shows this, this epidemic shows that, or this pandemic, that there's a usefulness to bad. I mean, you want to, you want people to, to be aware of this. It was funny, I was just reading something in Seattle when it started, and in New York, when the people who've been studying the virus and seeing it starting to spread went to the political leaders, and the political leaders are, well, we don't want to panic people about this. And the epidemiologists are saying, well, panic's not a bad thing to change their behavior. Yeah. And you want them to start washing their hands. You want them to start being more careful. And so panic is a good thing. Now, for a lot of things, panic, I think it causes bad things. But if it makes you wash your hands more often, that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. You talk about that. I was reading about that this morning, and I thought of your book because it's in Seattle. The scientists said, hey, make people aware, be aware of the bad, so we could do, whereas in New York it was a little bit slower. Is that, I don't know, that's the article
that's exactly
that you...
right. There's a good piece in the New Yorker by it. Yeah.
And I immediately thought, I read that this morning, I thought, hey, this is what these guys are talking about in this book, so yeah, that's a really good point. And Roy, you wanted to say something?
Oh, it's just one of the findings John found for our book that really made an impression on me was that after the September 11th bombings in New York 20 years ago or 19, that people became afraid to fly in airplanes, and so they drove more, and that caused an increase in traffic deaths, and more people died by the increase in traffic deaths than were killed in all those bombings that day.
So that's that catastrophizing. In theory, in a clinical sense, we call it the clinical illusion, and where you'll take the people, research is done on a population, and it's a percentage, but then it's generalized to the whole population. So you'll take one kind of pattern, and then they'll study the whole population. Now it's got that. When it's not, it's only a very small portion of the population. And so much mental health research is done like that. And it's actually dangerous. It's also catastrophizing how things are. So it kind of puts everything out of proportion. You get the wrong perspective, don't you?
Well, you do, and you get that so much from the way. One of the things Roy found in his original paper was that they look back at all the psychology journals and textbooks and found they devoted, I think it was at least twice or 2 or 3 times as much space to problems rather than to ways to help people. And then during, my business, journalists, we're in the business, we only pick out the scary findings. So and one example we use is that everyone's heard of PTSD, and it's led to this assumption that if there's a trauma in your life, you're going to be scarred by it. It's going to forever. And what people don't realize is that most people, the great majority of people who undergo trauma emerge stronger from it.
Exactly.
It's called post-traumatic growth, but nobody's heard of that.
That's it. Yeah. No, and it's related to neuroplasticity. It's the area that I work in. I mean, with people in trauma throughout, in war-torn zones, and you name it. And we see the changes. You can rewire that. You can actually, with neuroplasticity, you can change. So it doesn't go away. Your trauma's still there, but you can manage it. But it's not like you're stuck there and that's your destiny. You can, the way you're managing that, you turn that around and you can make that bad into good, like you saying.
Boy, what do you find in your work with war zones? I mean, do most people emerge stronger? Do you find?
So I've done work in post-genocide areas, like in Rwanda, and what you find is that when people are allowed to talk about it and express it, not push it down. So when you actually acknowledge that this is bad, not just pretend it doesn't exist, but this is bad, and you've got to then balance it with the good, exactly like you said. So for example, in Rwanda, what they did was they immersed people in a toxic bath of toxicity. So instead of moving on and accepting, they all they did was celebrate the death. And for years, they had all the bones lying around of the people that were murdered. And it was all just, they would have 100 days where they would just keep replaying things on TV. So people were kind of like COVID now, immersed in the toxicity. So your mind and your brain merge with what you're focusing on. So if that's all you're focusing on, and that's why your 1-to-4 ratio is fantastic, because you can't just go and focus on the negative and then think, and then that changes your physiology. You wire with that, you merge. So people then were you literally wire these protein structures into your dendrites in your brain that hold those images. And if that's what the energy has been given to, your brain then has this energy that's distorted, and then it disrupts your body. You have this negative feedback loop. So you've got to actually balance it with a positive. And they were advised, for example, very badly, Rwanda, for example, they were told by psychologists in the United Nations that you've got to immerse yourself in it. But they didn't tell them that you've got to acknowledge, process, and reconceptualize. And that's what I teach with my work. So you've got to, whoever's been through whatever trauma, I've worked in apartheid South Africa, pre and during and post, and the trauma, I'd spent 25 years working in those areas where people were traumatized by the political system and all that kind of thing. You have to embrace, you have to process, and you have to reconceptualize. So when you guys talk about focusing on the bad, that's embracing. When you talk about all the things, that you're countering, that's the processing and reconceptualizing and the learning that takes place. And that's why I love your work, because you're explaining something that people actually get, but you're doing it in such a positive way. You're giving solutions. So can you give some? Can you give some solutions? Can you take us through? I love your bad diet. Can you talk a little bit about that? I've got it over here. The low bad diet, how you can master the power of bad. I love that.
The low bad diet is basically that you're inundated, especially today. I mean, it's always been a problem, but the mass media is just geared toward bad, because the easiest way to get a mass audience is with, we all have the same universal fears of dying, and so you can easily it's the easiest way to attract attention, and there are these universal things everyone has. Whereas the good stuff that we're interested in, if we're interested in art or history, philosophy, science, whatever it is, those things tend to be much more niche products. There are people who are Civil War buffs in the United States. That they're interested in cosmology and in the history of the universe. Those are more niche things, and it's much harder with mass media. So mass media is all that bad stuff, and the good news about social media, we've heard all this stuff about how bad social media is. There's these ideas that there's Facebook depression and Instagram envy, and that stuff. I'd heard about it, and I was originally going to use that as an example of the power of bad. We have to do it. Then I started looking into the research as the people who'd done it, and it turned out that was kind of this bad hype that actually there are problems, but actually social media is more positive than mass media.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
People tend to share positive things more than the negative things. They also, people who tweet positively, you hear about these awful Twitter wars, but the norm is that if you tweet more positively, you get more followers and it actually spreads more widely.
Exactly.
So there's a benefit for being negative and for being positive in social media. So if you can curate your news feed, so you're not just getting, when there's a school ground shooting, when there's a terrorist attack, don't turn on cable news and watch live coverage for an hour. Just do something else. And when you curate your news feed with this low bad diet, you can basically start getting more positive things, focus on, and it gives you a more accurate picture of the world. Because on any given day, there's a lot more than 4 good things happening for one bad thing.
Exactly.
The news only has the bad thing. But, if you broaden your horizons and pick the right people to follow on Twitter, the right friends on Facebook, you start getting that good news and you get this accurate, you get this low bad diet.
I love that. And it goes to the question that you asked me earlier about do people from trauma recover? They do when you take them out of a toxic bath, when you actually reduce when you're not denying the negative. So you get the 1, but then you make sure that you counter with the 4, the 6, or the whatever. And then you can rewire your brain so you can remember how you were. So these Ugandan child soldiers or these people that people that have been through whatever they've been through, post-apartheid or whatever, you can actually then, this is what I was, but I can learn it so that it doesn't happen again in the future, or how I can prevent this, or how I can, use this to grow. So reducing looking at the good on social media. I interviewed an epidemiologist the other day who's really understands what's happening on the front lines. And he made a comment that I tell everyone, and that is that for the first time, humanity is facing a global enemy. So all of humanity, for the first time, facing a global enemy together. And the connections, there's so much, as you say, on social media. People are all out there coming up with courses and support systems and just to help each other. So that natural instinct to counter the bad with good is coming out.
Well, we call it the Pollyanna principle,
yes.
that the brain has these natural defenses against bad. One thing they find is that there are a lot more words for bad things. There are more ways to say something's bad than good because the brain really distinguishes among all these things. But even though there are more words for bad things, individual words, we use positive words much more often. The brain kind of compensates. We do that rule of 4 subconsciously where we just use good things. And, they find even on Twitter, for instance, when they monitor these things called a hedinometer, I think I'm pronouncing that right, where they measure the positive and negative words on Twitter and on Facebook and in all kinds of media. They've done it in movies, books, everything. And they find that even on like a terrible news day when there's an awful terrorist attack, things turn negative, but then people bounce back and they start, they start sharing stories about somebody who was heroic during it, how somebody's coping with it. It's that real natural. I mean, just the thing we're seeing now at night when people are all out, banging pans and clapping every night, there's that reaction to basically overcome the bad and let's focus on the positive side of it. I have to tell you, there's been these funny findings that nicotine is protective against, that smokers do not get COVID as much. And there's a theory. I mean, there's a lot of evidence, and I'm not urging anyone to smoke, but they're actually experimenting with people using nicotine patches on the workers because nicotine may interfere with the receptors for the virus. But somebody put out a thing saying we should have a clap for our cigarettes moment.
I love it. Oh gosh, and all the memes that I love that, and then it goes along. I can just see memes coming out of that. All the great memes that are out there. Roy, you wanted to say something? I love that.
No, I didn't.
I thought you wanted to say something. So you talk about if you can transition to working on curating your newsfeed. You've said that instead of obsessing about one snarky comment on social media, be a good enough partner. Do you want to talk a little bit more about some of these other points? Maybe.
I'm sure
a cheerful outlook can be cultivated.
Well,
what about that?
I mean, stuff for relationships. Some of the advice we offer. One thing is, and this is true for everything, but don't overpromise. This is one of these things that and they're really interesting experiments where they measure how people feel when something is delivered early, earlier than promised, or when someone gives more. And people don't really give that much credit when you do something extra. But if you fall short of a promise, if something is late, that makes a big difference. And we all suffer from this problem called the planning fallacy. We all think you'll get, that everything that we'll get stuff done more quickly than is realistic. So we tend to, we're very likely to overpromise our partner. I'll get this done, I'll do that. And when you fall short, that really makes a difference. So be careful on what you promise. And it's much more important to keep your promises than it is to go extra. We're getting back to this idea, be a good enough partner, a good enough parent. Not, you don't have to be the super parent, just basically get the basics done. So, and so that's why. And then another thing is to remember that, bad is really in the eye of the beholder. That, that if something really upsets your partner, you can sit there and tell yourself quite rationally, look, this is a trivial thing. Then, and your friends might all agree with you and say that, yes, she's being silly about this. But if it matters to them, it's having that impact. It's having that big disproportionate impact. And you have to take that into account. And, especially in relationships, when something does go wrong, it's really crucial to manage how you react to it because of the power of bad. They've done interesting experiments in these games called Dictator, where people cooperate with each other, and it's a test of whether people cooperate or not. When someone does something nice for the other side, the people tend to reciprocate more or less, But when someone does something bad, they don't just reciprocate; they escalate.
Yeah.
And then it goes back, and it just spirals out of control very quickly. So a minor argument turns into a huge disagreement. Do you want to talk about that, Roy, or do you?
Yes, I remember being struck by that when we were doing the original research that, of course, couples do good things and they do bad things, and the good things have good effects and the bad things have bad effects on the relationship. The bads have more. But what really, in terms of statistical power for predicting the course of the relationship, one person does something bad and so the other person does something bad in response to it. This is something to keep in mind when people are locked up together with their loved ones.
Yeah, like now.
You have to not do anything bad if you can avoid it. Especially if your partner does something bad, don't respond negatively. Because once that goes, the broader picture is people may say that their relationships get better and better over time, but that's mostly rationalization. The researchers who track relationships over time, they start off happy, some of them stay happy, most of them decline. There's no getting better. So the really thing to make a long-term relationship work is to slow down or prevent the downward cycle. And bad responses to bad behaviors are the biggest driver of downward cycles. So watch out especially for that.
That's fantastic. Can you give an example? I know that's really it's an excellent point you've made.
Example.
So basically, okay, go ahead, John.
Well, basically, being able to avoid taking the bait when something happens. Someone says something, you did that, and but you did that. And that really bugs. And then, now that we're talking about this, here's something that really bugs me about you, and it just escalates. And there's a great line when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice in the United States, on her wedding day, her mother-in-law said, "In every marriage, it sometimes helps to be a little deaf." And she said that she has followed that advice her whole career, including on the Supreme Court, that when someone says something nasty, you don't have to respond to it. You don't have to retaliate. Just ignore it if you can. Now, obviously, sometimes you can't. But the other thing is when a friend of ours keeps this thing, on his mirror, to keep himself, when he gets irritated by his wife's faults, he's got a thing on his mirror that says, "You're no bargain either."
I love that.
And it's really keep these things in perspective, and really also, and then try to swamp the bad by, remind yourself consciously of your partner's strengths. I mean, this is somewhat akin to, and we talk about this also about these exercises in gratitude, about counting your blessings. But think of your partner's strengths, and when they do something bad, you can think, well, yeah, it is bad that he's an obsessive overpacker. But at least when we get there, he's, he's going to have all the stuff he needs and maybe something I need. Try and look for, look for a bright side to it, and also, remind yourself of your partner's strengths, and also tell them when they do something good. Say, "I really like that when you do that. I so admire that about you." And we think not to do it, and we think people, well, they know that already, but it really makes a difference saying it out loud. And there's a great concept that they call positive illusions when they track couples, and they've done these things where they ask the couples to rate their partners for various things, and they ask the people themselves to rate themselves, and they find that some partners have this pretty unrealistic view of their partner, that they rate them for strengths that they don't really have, but those couples do great. And what happens also is over time, the partners start thinking about themselves. If your partner really believes in you, then it makes such a difference instead of just harping on the negative. So. And you start when someone says, "I really love it when you do that," they're going to do it again, instead of just, it's a great way of that positive reinforcement. So.
Oh, I love it. I love how you keep taking things that, when you first look at the power of bad, it may seem that you're focusing on the negative, but all you've spoken about the whole way is how you can take that and make it positive. You've just given endless amounts of positivity, which is wonderful. And you speak a little bit about, you mentioned gratitude. That's one of the exercises in the book. Yeah. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
What they found, in the positive psychology movement, and actually maybe Rory wants to talk about the positive psychology movement, because
I'd love you to do that. Yeah, I'd love you to do that.
Okay, well, the positive psychology started, as a historical phenomenon in the field of psychology. Initially it focused on negative things and mental illness and problems and stress and how can we improve that. And only slowly people started to say, well, that's not all we should do in psychology. I mean, yes, of course, bad is stronger than good. It's more important. And the first thing is, let's help the people who are really needing immediate help or having serious unhappiness and problems. And yes, but then we should also, getting to zero, to the neutral point, is not enough. We want to also do some studies into raising neutral into positive, and can we make people happier on a permanent basis? And one of the things that they did found that worked was with the gratitude exercise. You can't do it every day because you quickly run out, but think of someone who did you some favor or something good some time ago, and write them a letter or send an email or something and reach out and let them know. Or the counting the blessings. I think John mentioned that earlier. Once a week or so on, sit down and list several things that you're thankful for, the things that have gone well, and it sort of directs the mind to positive things. Positive psychologists are now working on how to celebrate. I heard some interesting new findings on that. And your partner says, "Oh, I just got this award" or something, and you say, "Oh, that's great, dear. You really deserve it. That's wonderful." And you let it go. But no, you should instead try to share the experience. What happened when you found out? Did you open the email? Do this? What was the first thing you suspected? What was it a reaction to? Tell me everything, and you try to share as much of the experience with them as possible. Our friend Marty Seligman was telling, he was teaching some people in the Army some of these positive psychology techniques, and he had this drill sergeant who was super serious and so on. And Marty told him, "Well, this is how you celebrate." And the next day, his son called and said, or I guess he was talking to his wife, and his wife says, "Oh, our son wants to tell you something." And he says, "Dad, I hit a home run." And so the drill sergeant, who had never done anything like this, said, apply these techniques. Says, "Okay, well, tell me exactly what was the count, what was going on in the game, how did it happen, how did you feel, what did your teammates say?" Why did the kid say, "Are you really my father?"
Oh, I love that. That's so funny. We're so not used to that. Oh gosh, that's so good. Well, you see how much good we can do if we change the way we've got so many tools in our mental toolbox, don't we, to be able to be human. I keep saying that. I keep saying we need to be human again. And I feel like this COVID-19 quarantine has actually taught us to really look deep down inside of ourselves and look at how we can connect better and get more deep and meaningful in our relationships and find those good things and the humor and turn the bad into good, like you two are talking about all the time. So,
no, it really does. That process we're always talking about, capitalization, I think is the term for it, right? The worst thing is if a friend or your partner tells you something good happened and you just nod.
It's not enough.
Really, that's actually really bad, because they were feeling good about it, and your reaction, it just deflates them, and then they're angry about why aren't I recognized? But and it's so simple to do. I've started, once I read about this research, I do it all the time. And, it's just, wow, that's great. What happened, and that's so wonderful. And keep it just a few simple techniques.
Yeah.
And it makes it, there's a line we quote from Mark Twain saying that, that grief can be borne alone, but for a joy to be appreciated, it must be shared.
I love that.
And that is, that's really so true. You want to share joy.
And
at least fake it, even if you don't care. At least fake it.
I love that. Fake it. So, but that's so important. I just love the fact that you've said not just to acknowledge, but to actually dig it. It takes 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds.
Ask a couple questions. Wow, that must be so. How did it happen?
How did you feel? What's the next thing?
Yeah, and it's nicer for you too.
Exactly.
For the partner, because you get to participate and share all the feelings and the excitement. So
and that feeds back. And I mean, there's a bunch of quantum physics things I can think of that are going on there, and a bunch of brain things, and it's just all optimizing how we function as humans. You guys are amazing. I just love your approach and what you've done and what you're contributing. It's just incredibly uplifting. So it's really, really great. So could you both give me, just to wrap this up, could you both give a pearl of wisdom? What would you tell people now in this COVID time? Or do you want to share something about what you're concerned about or what you're excited about? Or what would you like to say related to anything that you feel would help people?
I know people are thinking about the pandemic and so on, and people have asked me about that. It's sort of a coincidence that our book was published right at the same time.
Yeah.
And I don't want to minimize. There are certainly bad aspects of it, and people are dying, and there are problems and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to say, it's almost sure we're overreacting to it, because that's just how the mind works. And that includes our leaders and the population, and the leaders and the people have to respond to each other and so on. So I'm reluctant to say, don't worry, it's not bad. I mean, that's not the issue, but it's probably safe to say we are overreacting. It's not going to be as bad as certainly as the worst case scenarios that were going to be featured in the media, because that's how they're bread and butter.
You know, I have to comment on that just because I love what you've just said. I've been trying to say that sort of thing a lot in all the talks that I give as well, similar lines, to actually balance that negativity, because there's so much positive. And I always say the scientists are like the adults in the house at the moment. The scientists are excitedly searching across borders, boundaries. There's no competition. It's actually, how do we solve this together? And it's progressive. Whereas as you say, the politicians, and there's so much, and the negative, and even the negative media, if you look at the scientific media, it's actually, even though they don't have answers, there's a very positive collaboration that's happening, as opposed to just being negative, and that gives more balance and perspective. So I think what I hear you saying is that if we try and be more like a scientist in our thinking, and we actually will be more realistic and positive and get a better perspective. And yeah, think of 4 good things for every bad thing. Try and read one news media that's negative, am I right? And then go and find 4 good things immediately before you go read another negative. I love that. I love what you said there. Yes, John.
No, and I think Roy is exactly right. We have a chapter in the book called The Crisis, and there are 3 rules. And that's our name for this tendency that the world is always in crisis. There's always something now COVID is a real, it's a real pandemic. It's a real threat. So we're not minimizing that. But I still think, the 3 rules we have when you're contemplating, the latest crisis, whatever it is, and this is a general rule, is the number 1, that the world will always seem to be in crisis. Number 2 is that the crisis is never as bad as it sounds. And number 3, which I think is the most important right now, is the solution could easily make things worse. And I think, as we talked earlier, the power of bad, the negativity effect, is very useful in getting people to pay attention to this pandemic. That, as we said, panic can be useful, that you want people to wash their hands, you want them to be careful what they do. You especially want people who are vulnerable to this to take special precautions, and for everyone else to protect them too. But the danger is that once you've done that, then you start, shutting down economies, you start doing all kinds of other things. And the danger is that it's going to cause more loss of life and a lot more damage than the problem itself. And, we now have gotten so focused on this one particular issue that every COVID death now looms much larger than, than all the other. I saw one estimate, someone was saying that and I don't know if this is realistic or not, but it was someone threw out this estimate that because of all the people that aren't going in to be, for routine checks for diagnostic tests, that 50,000 people could die of cancer because their cancer wasn't
heart attacks
detected in time. Yeah. And so, so basically, if you get so focused on this one storm and this one threat, then you cause, much greater problems down the road. So, and we also have this bad tendency, we focus on immediate threats. It's hard to think of long-term threats. And I think, as you say, it's getting that scientific, that rational brain. You want to
balance
get that and overcome your visceral response to bad.
Wisdom. That's just brilliant. I love what you both said. That's incredibly good wisdom and incredibly encouraging for people in this time. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing your time and everything. It's been great. I could talk to you for hours. It's like a million more questions I have to ask you. But thank you. And I hope I could invite you both back again sometime, because it's been wonderful. I think there's a lot of other areas we could dive into as well and talk about. It's really interesting. How can people find out about you and your work?
Well, it's The Power of Bad. It's available at booksellers everywhere, and it's from Penguin Press. The Power of Bad: How the Negativity Effect Rules Us and How We Can Rule It. And I guess just we have to say that to really overcome the power of bad, you have to buy the book. So.
There you go. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed this, and it's been amazing.
Okay,
so
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay,
Stay
bye.
safe. Bye.
Bye.